I'd like to start with two very brief introductions. First, to express my profound gratitude to the Prado, particularly to the director, Miguel Zugatha, to the sub-director, Gabriele Finaldi, for their support of the restoration of the Wellington Danae, and, of course, to Elisa Mora for having resurrected a painting which we all feared might be beyond recovery. It was thanks to them that an hypothesis actually became an historical fact. Without their intervention, the Wellington Danae would probably have remained in a kind of limbo. And very particularly, of course, to Miguel Falomir, whose enthusiasm for the picture, I think, electrified the director and sub-director, and who I think was really the generating force in bringing the Danae to Madrid, and with whom I enjoyed the best possible collaboration on the catalogue. Even our disagreements were of the warmest and friendliest kind. And I'd also wish to say a word or two about this lecture, that for those of you who have seen the exhibition and read the excellent wall labels, you will recognise a certain amount of repetition. For those who've read the catalogue, you will, I'm afraid, find still more repetition. There is material in my lecture which is not there, but inevitably you will find that a number of the points made in the catalogue are repeated. It is notable that in the Cinquecento, paintings of mythological subjects tended to be produced in pairs or in series rather than as single images. Perhaps this was a legacy from the continuous narration familiar from Cassoni and Spalliera panels, and appropriately, the earliest mythological paintings that we have from the young Titian, the pair of panels which are now in Padua, seem to have been planned for a frieze. Both subjects are taken from Ovid, and this one is, of course, the birth of Adonis, who we will meet later on. It is likely that Titian and his associates, his friends, once produced more paintings of this type, but panels produced as furnishing have suffered disproportionate losses. The first scheme of large-scale mythological or quasi-mythological paintings in which Titian was certainly involved was that for the Studiolo of Alfonso d'Este, Duke of Ferrara. Titian contributed 3 paintings out of the 5 planned for the Studiolo, but when he joined the project in 1518, the programme had largely, but not wholly, been decided and was underway. Indeed, Titian's 3 paintings were all substitutes for paintings commissioned from other artists, which they had failed to deliver. The programme was based on Philostratus' account of, in the Imagines, of a gallery of paintings in Naples in the 1st century AD. It is disputed whether this was a description of a real collection or an exercise in descriptive imagination. Alfonso's scheme was envisaged as a recreation of some paintings of the series that Philostratus described, but the subjects seem to have been selected for their association with love and wine rather than as dramatic narratives. Thus, the worship of Venus, which of course you all know intimately, is an evocation of human fecundity. The Bacchanal of the Andrians is effectively a festival of vintage, and only Bacchus and Ariadne in the National Gallery is truly a narrative painting. But the Studiolo was not the only secular scheme that Alfonso commissioned. And for another, or for others, he seems to have chosen mythological narratives. We lack precise documentation, but he apparently commissioned Dosso Dossi, the Ferrarese artist, to paint at least a pair or perhaps a series of the loves of the gods, of which we have Apollo and Daphne in the Galleria Borghese on the left, and the recently discovered Jupiter and Semele on the right, now in a private collection in London. These two paintings, I should say, are the same height. Titian, a friend of Dosso, who had worked with him in Alfonso's Studiolo, would certainly have known these paintings. But Titian's involvement may have gone further. He too may have contributed or planned to contribute canvases to another scheme or other schemes devised by Alfonso. We know that Titian began for Alfonso a large canvas of Minerva and Venus, which was left unfinished at the Duke's death in 1534, because he said so to Vasari. Vasari saw the unfinished painting in Titian's workshop in 1566, while Titian was reworking it and transforming it into a Counter-Reformation allegory of religion succoured by Spain for the Emperor Maximilian. The canvas that Titian sent to Maximilian is lost, but it is recorded in an engraving by Giulio Fontana, shown here, which was published in 1568. A few years later, Titian painted another version of religion succoured by Spain for Philip II, which you all know very well, in which he made a few modifications to Maximilian's painting. Parenthetically, this story demonstrates that Titian was willing to reinterpret as well as to rework his own paintings, and that he had no difficulty in resurrecting a canvas laid in around 30 years earlier. It also demonstrates that his greatest patron, Philip II, had no objection to receiving autograph repetitions of paintings conceived for others, for other patrons, that is. I shall return in a moment to Minerva and Venus, which, I repeat, has a secure connection with Alfonso d'Este. We now know that Titian invented the subject of Adonis taking leave of Venus in the 1520s, much earlier than had previously been thought. However, the invention of the 1520s took a different form from the renderings with which we are familiar. In this first treatment of the subject, Adonis takes his leave tenderly of Venus, laying his arm affectionately around her shoulder. A small painting of this type, I call it the tender type, the one I show you now, was formerly in Vienna in the Kunsthistorisches Museum, but it was destroyed or lost at the end of World War II, and only black and white photographs of it survive. But a miniature copy of this painting was made by Peter Oliver in 1631, when the painting was in the collection of the Earl of Arundel, and this shows that its colours were precisely comparable with those of the Bacchanal of the Andrians. And to add a word here, those colours and that combination of colours is not used by Titian at any other period of his career. It also has coloristic and formal links with the Venus, with the Bacchus and Ariadne. It was pointed out that the pose of the dog here is really very like that of the cheetah. The lost Vienna painting measured 96 by 118 centimetres, though I think it had been trimmed a little, and a treatment of the subject in Washington on the right, which is generally dated around 1660, some 30 years or more after the lost Vienna canvas, is only a little larger at 101 times 136 centimetres. The Washington painting shows the second version of Adonis' departure, which we have called the abrupt type. Adonis' right arm is raised, and he grasps a dart, preparatory, of course, for hunting. But beneath, and there is the Washington canvas by itself, but beneath the surface of this canvas, this is the X-ray, which is quite difficult to read, is a lay-in corresponding to the tender version. I think here you can just see Adonis' right arm, but I show you an analysis of the lay-in made by my friend Alec Cobb, which shows that the pose of Adonis' arm and the pose of the hunting dog was essentially the same as in the lost Vienna canvas. I suspect that the Washington painting was actually laid in during the 1520s, concurrently with the Vienna canvas, and that it was given its final surface only decades later, just like the Minerva and Venus. Sorry. To repeat, the Washington Adonis taking leave of Venus and the lost Vienna Adonis taking leave of Venus are both small. But it has recently become clear that Titian also began a large version to the tender design. This is the painting rediscovered only a few years ago and now in a private collection in Moscow. X-rays show that under the surface of this painting, there is the X-ray, which also shows the extent of the damage. X-rays show that under the surface of the Moscow painting is a lay-in of the tender version. I think you can see it very clearly here. And here is a diagram which explicates this. This discovery by our generous colleague in Moscow, Vittoria Markova, proves that Titian, presumably from the beginning of his ideas about this subject, thought of issuing precisely the same composition on a large scale as well as on a small one. Later in his career, he differentiated between large and small versions of Venus and Adonis in various ways. But initially, he seems to have been happy to repeat the same composition at different sizes. We cannot prove that it was Alfonso d'Este who commissioned this large Venus taking leave of Adonis, Adonis taking leave of Venus, but it seems to me to be likely. I am tempted to think that, like the Minerva and Venus, it remained unfinished at Alfonso's death, subsequently to be overlaid with a revised, abrupt version of the subject. It would have fitted Thematically, with Dosso's canvases of Apollo and Daphne and Jupiter and Semele, and that its subject, Adonis taking leave of Venus, represented, like those, a love that proved disastrous. And the height of all three pictures would have been similar. Of course, I here show you the small Vienna picture, but you must imagine that as on a larger scale, the scale of the Moscow picture. If this hypothesis is correct, it offers a possible explanation for the existence of the Minerva and Venus. The subject, which seems to be unprecedented in the period, combines allegory and narrative in a way that fits well into Alfonso's tastes. For the goddesses embody, respectively, intellect and passion. Thus, the subject could be seen as a debate or even as a confrontation between those attributes. But the painting that Titian began might also have depicted a specific occasion. Might we be justified in thinking that Minerva is succouring Venus? Might Minerva and Venus be a sequel to Adonis taking leave of Venus, in which Minerva attempts to console Venus for the death of her lover? Such subjects would also have fitted well with those of Dosso, in which, to repeat, the loves of the gods led to disaster. Now I shall test your patience by taking my hypotheses a little further. Miguel Falamea pointed out to me that in Titian's inventory, in Philip's inventory, of 1553, a Mars and Venus is mentioned. There is no certainty that this painting was by Titian, but we have no good reason to think otherwise. It does not seem to be mentioned again, and so far as I'm aware, we have no further knowledge of it. Miguel has suggested that it may have been sold or given to Pompeo Leone, to whom it would appear the Perseus and Andromeda was given. Nor do we know what size this painting, the Mars and Venus, was. But Titian and his studio had certainly executed a Mars and Venus some years earlier, of which there is a version in Vienna. The history of this Mars and Venus is identical with that of the lost Adonis taking leave of Venus, destroyed in Vienna, and the two paintings were the same size. In short, they were a pair. Perhaps a large version of the subject of Mars and Venus was also planned for Alfonso d'Este, and after his death was finished and presented to Philip. If so, this would suggest a different possibility of reconstruction. Perhaps Titian's canvases were unconnected with those of Dosso. Might he rather have planned for Alfonso a sequence of canvases devoted to stories of Venus, with the inclusion of happy as well as tragic events? And this is just a possible proposition. One can only hope that future discoveries might throw some light on these suggestions. We'll just summarize really what I have said, because it's quite complicated, that it seems to me very likely that Titian planned a mythological sequence of some kind, perhaps in conjunction with Dosso Dossi, for Alfonso d'Este before Alfonso's death, and this is important when we come to the sequence devised for Philip. I remind you that the first version of Venus and Adonis taking leave of Venus, of Adonis taking leave of Venus, was a tender interpretation of the subject. Adonis has his arm round Venus's shoulder, and although he leaves her, he does so lovingly. In the second interpretation of the subject, and I show you again the Lost Vienna, the Oliver copy of the Lost Vienna canvas and the Washington canvas, Adonis' departure is abrupt. He moves away decisively from Venus, holding the dart in his right hand and raising his right arm, and the age difference between the lovers, which is not found in the tender version, is now emphasized. It's clearly an older woman and a younger man. At some point, therefore, between these two renderings, Titian decided to rework the action and the emotion, and at the same time, he decided upon a more somber colour scheme. I think it probable that Titian executed a painting of this new type for an unknown client around 1540. The original is lost, but I think it is recorded in an engraving by Raphael Sadler III, dated 1610. It is also known in painted copies. The lower one on the right, and I apologise for the quality, is a photograph of a painting that passed through the London art market some 60 years ago and has not, so far as I'm aware, reappeared. Another, that at the upper left, came to light recently in a provincial auction. It was pointed out to me by my friend Jonathan Yarker, and I was fortunate enough to acquire it. It is not a masterpiece, it's a fairly feeble painting, but it probably dates from the 17th century, and it does seem to be accurate. In contrast to Miguel, and this is one of the very rare matters on which we disagree, Sadler's print seems to me to follow this lost painting rather than the one in Washington, which Miguel and I think all other scholars connected. So, Washington, the copy, my possession, the Raphael Sadler engraving. I simply leave it to you to decide. To my eye, the engraving is closer to the picture on the lower right. The Washington version has an engraving, has a rainbow in it, which is not in either the engraving or the other painting. And Adonis' figural proportions are considerably more elongated than in the Washington version, and I simply ask you to look at his right leg in all three. These more elongated proportions are seen in another lost canvas of Adonis taking leave of Venus, which the historian of Venetian art, Carlo Ridolfi, says was painted for Cardinal Alessandro Farnese. Alessandro's patronage has not so far been corroborated by contemporary documents, but I assume Ridolfi's statement to be correct. The Farnese canvas is identified in this 18th century engraving made when the original painting was on display in Capodimonte in Naples, from where it was lost, whence it was lost around 1800. The engraving is broadly informative, but it contains several embellishments, including the foliage at the lower right, seen in no other version, and I think these must be regarded as embellishments by the engraver. A more accurate account is provided by several painted copies, one of which is in the Accademia di San Fernando, little painting there. Another larger and I think more accurate copy is in the City Art Gallery in York. And there are at least two others. As in the painting copied by Sadler, Adonis has sharp features, but unlike, and quite long legs, but unlike that, his shoulders are now covered. There I just show the little picture in my possession and the copy of the lost Farnese picture to make the comparison. It seems to be characteristic of Titian that when he produced new versions of an existing subject, the actors become more richly dressed to allow coloristic and textural elaboration. The height of the Farnese Adonis taking leave of Venus, as we know from inventories, was identical with that of the Danae, now in Naples, which Titian had consigned to Alessandro Farnese in 1545, and this identity of height must have been deliberate so that they could be hung in line and compared and contrasted. Of course, I draw your attention to the pairing of the subjects. Titian met the 21-year-old Philip for the first time in Milan in 1549, and it may have been then that he was requested by the prince to paint a series of mythologies. But it is more likely, I think much more likely, that the commission was determined 2 years later when Titian and the prince met again in Augsburg. We do not know why a nearly square format was chosen, and here I show the Prado Venus and Adonis, of course. But it remains constant throughout the 6 canvases that Titian delivered to Philip. The format is actually quite close to that of Alfonso d'Este's bacchanals, which range from 170 to 175 centimetres in height and from 175 to 188 centimetres in width. And while Titian may have been responding to Philip's wishes, it was probably a format that he wished to explore further. I also think that Titian was eager, perhaps desperate, to pursue a kind of mythological painting that he does seem to have projected for Alfonso, but which had been cut short. As all scholars have noted, Titian would have known of the beautiful canvases of the Loves of the Gods, painted by Antonio Correggio for Federico Gonzaga, which had been given to Charles V, of course the father of Philip II, and Titian must have itched to emulate these. It is likely, even if Philip did not have a specific location in mind before he was then without settled abode, that he planned to house the mythologies in a large private room rather than a gallery. Such a location is certainly implied in Titian's letter to Philip of September 1554, in which he makes it clear that the Adonis taking leave of Venus, this painting which he sent with, which letter accompanied, and the Danae, which he had already delivered, were conceived as pendants, whether side by side or facing one another. The first 2 mythologies delivered by Titian to Philip, therefore, were versions of paintings that he had executed previously, and of which examples had already been paired in the Farnese collection. Whether Philip knew of the Farnese canvases and requested versions of them, or whether Titian proposed this pairing, cannot be determined, but it seems probable that the initiative was Philip's. As I remarked above, Philip had no problems ordering versions of earlier paintings. The Wellington Danae was the first canvas to be delivered, but it was not wholly successful. The Farnese Danae was oriented horizontally and had grown out of a similarly horizontal sequence of images. To expand the composition to a square created something of a strain. And it is notable that although Titian and his studio repeated the subject of Danae on several occasions, twice in an upright format, he never again produced a square version. Nor did he ever again include the eagle or wore Jupiter so prominent a role. As you will be aware, we know of these features now excised from the Wellington canvas, cut as Miguel found out in 1772. We know of these because soon after Titian's Danae arrived in Flanders, Philip commissioned a copy of it from Antonius More. If we can trust what seems to be a copy of this copy, it shows that More found Titian's composition uncomfortable and actually reduced it somewhat in height from a square. It may be that the rather awkward arrangement of Titian's painting, despite the exceptional quality of the fragment that remains, the exceptional quality of execution of the fragment that remains, but perhaps the rather awkward overall arrangement of Titian's painting was part of the reason that Philip's Danae, still in the Alcazar in 1624, was substituted in the 1630s probably by the canvas brought to Spain in 1632 by Velázquez on his return to Italy, and Philip's canvas was transferred to the less prestigious venue of the Buen Retiro. It is perhaps also worth saying that in a period in Madrid where painting was dominated by Velázquez, the later style of Titian would have corresponded more to current tastes than the more precise and sharply focused style of the first Danae, of Philip's Danae. The first two mythologies that Titian sent to Philip were, therefore, as I have said, versions of pictures that he had painted before. As far as we know, the following four canvases were all new inventions. The third canvas to be sent in 1556 was the heroic Perseus rescuing Andromeda, now in the Wallace collection in London. Since Perseus is Danae's son, there was also a direct familial link with the canvas of Danae, but this genealogical approach was not pursued in succeeding paintings. In the letter to Philip that announced he was working on the Perseus and would soon deliver it, Titian said that he was about to proceed with a Jason and Medea. This is the sole mention of this subject, and we have no evidence for Titian's conception, either thematic or visual. But we may reasonably assume that he planned to represent the tragic end of the story. However, if this was the intention, Titian presumably jettisoned it. He, or Philip, may have found the prospect of butchered children too distressing to contemplate. As it is, we hear nothing more about the Jason. But what Titian's letter makes clear to us is that the subjects of the canvases were not fixed at the outset, and that the painter had considerable, perhaps complete, freedom in his choice of Ovidian narratives. The Perseus was followed by two paintings delivered together 3 years later in 1559. Callisto's pregnancy revealed to Diana, and Actaeon surprising Diana and her nymphs bathing. In the letter that accompanied these two canvases, Titian told Philip that he had a death of Actaeon, presumably the canvas probably just unfinished, in the National Gallery in London. He told him he had this canvas well advanced. But in the event, the death of Actaeon was never sent to Philip. And the next and last of the 6 mythologies that the king received was the abduction of Europa in 1562, which marked the term of the mythologies Titian sent to Philip. Titian's letter to the king of the 26th of April 1562, in which he says, "E benché quanto alle ordine che della vostra cattolica maestà mi fu imposto, non mi resti a fare altro," could well be taken to prove that with the dispatch of the Europa, he had fulfilled his quota. But we know that Philip's initial commission was not fixed in subject matter, and neither may it have been fixed in number. Perhaps in some communication that does not survive, Philip, at a certain point, curtailed a series planned to be more extensive. In any case, it is well known that the king's mood had darkened by the early 1560s, and mythologies were no longer to his taste. The possibility that Titian had hoped to extend the series, again, lies in the realm of hypothesis, but there are several arguments in its support. But first, we need to consider whether there is any visual and thematic logic to be described in the 6 canvases that Titian did deliver to Philip. As we know, the Danae and Adonis taking leave of Venus are pendants because Titian said they were in his 1554 letter to Philip. Danae shows a mortal woman accepting the love of the god and brings forth Jupiter's child, Perseus, who finally rescues her. In sum, her story is a positive one. Adonis taking leave of Venus, on the other hand, represents a triumph of inexperience on Adonis's part. And to insert a mention, this is precisely the way this subject is interpreted in contemporary engravings produced within Titian's lifetime, that it's Adonis's foolishness in leaving Venus which is emphasized. A tragedy of inexperience, then, on Adonis' part, but also a tragedy for Venus, the goddess of love, unable to retain her lover. It is reasonable to suppose that Titian thought of the succeeding canvases in a similar way, also illustrating the light and the dark of the pagan gods, the happy, even comedic aspects of the Olympians and their tragic aspects too. Actaeon surprising Diana and Callisto's pregnancy revealed to Diana show the goddess's injustice, and this, incidentally, is made clear, entirely clear in Ovid. Her injustice, not to say her cruelty. Perseus rescuing Andromeda, on the other hand, is very obviously a positive subject. The abduction of Europa, finally, is again a positive subject, although feminists might blanch to hear it. Europa gives birth to Jove's children, becomes queen of Crete, and eventually bequeaths her name to Europe. Titian treats her abduction with festive wit, as Europa, in an ungainly but inviting pose, looks up to the reassuring Cupids flying escort above her. Thus, the 6 canvases divide into 3 happy myths and 3 tragic ones. They also fall into 3 complementary pairs visually. Danae and Adonis taking leave of Venus show, as Titian said in his letter to Philip, the female body from the front and the back, and in both paintings a divinity appears in the air. Actaeon surprising Diana and Callisto's pregnancy revealed to Diana work very elegantly together as visitors to the National Gallery in London, where they currently hang, can see for themselves. And although the 2 Diana canvases intervened between them, Perseus rescuing Andromeda meshes wonderfully with the abduction of Europa. Both are aquatic and both are festive. Let us now turn to numbers. 6 canvases is not an immediately satisfactory number for a decorative scheme. Rooms generally have 4 walls, and for a room it would be natural to commission 4 canvases, or, if the room was sufficiently large, 8. 6 is a number that might be ordered for a specific space, but since no specific space could have been envisaged at the start of the project, it is a number difficult to explain. 8 would seem a more rational number, and indeed we have knowledge from Titian himself, as I have said, of 2 further projected canvases. One only in a mention in a letter, the Jason and Medea, but the other, the death of Actaeon, both mentioned and very nearly finished. Had these two canvases been delivered to Philip, they would have made up, had these two paintings been delivered to Philip, they would have made up 8 canvases. However, as you will immediately recognise, Jason and Medea and the death of Actaeon are both tragic subjects, which would upset the thematic balance. Can this issue be resolved? In 1567, 5 years after he had dispatched the abduction of Europa to Philip, Titian offered to the Emperor Maximilian repetitions of the mythological canvases that he had sent to the Spanish king. But the list he provided has interesting differences from Philip's complement. In total, Titian offered Maximilian neither 6 nor 8 canvases, but 7, an irregular number and a difficult number to explain. It was one more than he had delivered to Philip, but one fewer than necessary for a quartet of pairings. The 7 he listed includes the death of Actaeon, here intended for Philip, but then unfinished in Titian's workshop. But much more surprisingly, instead of Danae, which is not listed, Titian offered Maximilian a Diana and Endymion, a subject he had never mentioned to Philip and is not otherwise known to have treated. May it be that Titian also began for Philip a Diana and Endymion, which was also unfinished and undelivered? Titian painted several nocturnal scenes at the end of the 1550s and the first half of the 1560s, and a Diana and Endymion subject would have made most sense as a night scene. I just show you, here a canvas that was brought to my attention very recently. I have no idea who did it. It was absurdly attributed to Pietro da Cortona, with whom it has nothing to do. I'm not suggesting for a moment that it records a lost Titian, but it does give one an idea of the kind of thing that one of the possibilities that might have been envisaged for a treatment of this subject. The landscape actually is quite Venetian. Why Titian dropped the Danae, did not mention the Danae to Maximilian, we don't know and can only speculate. Perhaps Titian felt that the version of Danae sent to Philip was unsatisfactory and wanted to substitute another subject. I think that's probably likely. Or perhaps Maximilian already owned a Danae, which actually is the explanation I would prefer. If we assume that Maximilian did own a Danae, he would have ended up with 8 canvases. But whatever way we explain Titian's list, the 2 new subjects, the death of Actaeon and the Diana of Endymion, would have maintained the thematic balance of tragic and happy. Furthermore, the love affair between Diana and the beautiful shepherd Endymion would have shown a pleasanter side of the goddess than the 2 completed Diana canvases and, of course, the death of Actaeon. We have, of course, as I say, no evidence for Titian's design of Diana and Endymion, but I refer you again to this canvas as just a possible clue to what Titian might have been thinking about. Maximilian did not take up Titian's offer, but it does seem that Titian received at least one commission, we don't know from whom, for a repetition of one of the canvases he had sent to Philip. It is not known who ordered this version of Callisto's pregnancy revealed to Diana. It is now in the Kunsthistorisches Museum in Vienna, and although it is sometimes connected with the offer to Maximilian, there is no secure evidence to link it with the emperor. The painting is unimpressive in execution and must be mostly, perhaps entirely, by Titian's studio. But if it does not reveal Titian's hand, it does reveal Titian's mind. The group of nymphs who cluster around Callisto and strip her to reveal her pregnancy are much more coherently conceived than in Philip's version, and the standing nymph at the left, confusingly nude, in Philip's version. At first sight, we think of her almost as Callisto, and Callisto's in the shadow, is much more appropriately clothed in the second version. The Vienna Callisto is a suitable place to end this lecture because it shows that Titian, even when he did not execute a canvas, nevertheless controlled its organisation. It also demonstrates that he continued to contemplate and, when he felt it necessary, to revise his earlier formulations. Even near the end of his life, his narrative and psychological intelligence was still functioning at full power, as was his capacity for transformation. And I remind you again, to close, of religion succoured by Spain, transformed from Minerva and Venus in the same span of years. Thank you.